The cantina on Nexus Prime was alive with noise. Dozens of different alien species sat at tables, drinking and talking in their own languages. The sound mixed together like a strange song that never ended. Most creatures stayed near the bright lights in the center of the room, but in the darkest corner, far from everyone else, sat someone who preferred the shadows. Zixthera was old for a Kethmori warrior. Her insect-like body showed the marks of many battles. Where other Kethmori had natural arms and legs, she had shining metal replacements. 4 cybernetic arms moved with tiny whirry sounds whenever she reached for her drink, or compound. Eyes like those of a giant fly could see in all directions at once. Deep scars crossed her hard shell-like skin, each one telling a story of violence and survival. She sat alone because she wanted to be alone. The memories were always there, waiting in the quiet moments. Even now, 50 years after the war ended, she could still hear the screams and smell the burning metal of destroyed ships. The young soldiers in the cantina did not understand what real war looked like. They'd grown up in peacetime, thinking they knew everything about fighting. At a nearby table, 3 young officers from the Vrex military were getting drunk on fermented algae wine. Their scales shimmered with bright colors that only appeared on Vrex who had never seen real combat. Battle-tested Vrex had scales that turned dull gray, a change that happened when their bodies experienced the shock of warfare. These 3 still looked like they had just graduated from military school. The loudest of the young Vrex stood up and pointed toward the dark corner where Zixthera sat. His voice carried across the cantina, slurred from too much drinking.
Look.
At that old bug in the corner, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, probably telling war stories about fighting space pirates or smugglers. I bet she never faced anything really dangerous. His friends laughed and encouraged him to continue. The Vrex officer took a few steps closer to Zixthera's table, his chest puffed out with false courage. Heard the Kethmori fought in some war against humans decades ago, he continued, his voice getting louder. Humans. Can you believe that? Those soft-skinned primitives who barely figured out how to leave their own planet. What kind of threat could they possibly be to real warriors? The cantina grew quieter as other patrons began to listen. As some of the older aliens at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few got up and moved to different areas of the room as if they did not want to be associated with what was about to happen. Zixthera slowly turned her massive head toward the young Vrex. Her compound eyes reflected the dim lights of the cantina, like tiny mirrors. When she looked at someone, it felt like being examined by a predator deciding whether you were worth eating. The mandibles around her mouth clicked together in a rhythm that other species had learned to fear during the war. Humans, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly across the room. I fought humans. The young Vrex officer laughed again, but this time it sounded forced and nervous. See? Just like I said, probably. Chased a few human traitors away from Coalition space and thinks that makes her a war hero. Zixthera stood up slowly. Her full height became apparent as she rose from the chair. Kethmori were naturally tall, but Zixthera was larger than most of her species. Her cybernetic legs hissed softly as hydraulic systems adjusted to support her weight. She took one step toward the Vrex officer, then stopped. Instead of moving closer, she raised her synthetic left arm. The metal limb gleamed under the cantina lights, and the servos whirred as mechanical fingers pointed to a deep scar that ran across her carapace. The scar was old, but still clearly visible, a jagged line that went from her left shoulder down to her lower torso. This came from a human named Jack Miller, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made the young officer's laughter die in his throat. He was dying when he gave me this scar. Half his chest was blown away by plasma. Fire from our heavy weapons. His left arm was completely gone, torn off by shrapnel from an exploding bulkhead. Blood was pouring out of him so fast that it should have killed him in seconds. Ah! The cantina had become completely silent now. Even the background music from the bar's sound system seemed to fade away. But Jack Miller did not die quietly. Zixthera continued, her mandibles clicking faster now. He pulled a combat knife from his boot with his remaining hand and buried it in the neck of my squad leader. Then he rolled behind cover, and somehow managed to kill 2 more of my soldiers before his body finally gave out. She tapped her right leg prosthetic with one of her other hands. The sound of metal hitting metal rang through the quiet room. This leg was destroyed thanks to Lieutenant Sarah Chen during the siege of Luna. She was a mining engineer before the war started. Did you know that? Just a civilian who worked on asteroid mining stations. But when we attacked her facility, she proved that humans do not think like other species. Zixthera's voice grew softer, but somehow more frightening. While my unit was trying to capture her station, she rigged the entire fusion reactor to overload. Not to destroy the station and escape, mind you. She rigged it to explode at exactly the right moment to take out our command ship when it moved into docking position. She stayed behind to make sure the timing was perfect, knowing she would die in the explosion. The young Vrex officer had gone completely quiet. His bright scales were beginning to show patches of dull gray, his body's automatic response to extreme stress. From behind the bar, an old Hextarian trader named Grix looked up from the glass he was cleaning. Grix had run this cantina for over 70 years and had served drinks to soldiers from dozens of wars. His 6 arms moved in practiced motions as he prepared a fresh drink, but his attention was focused on the conversation happening across the room. "Tell them about the war, old warrior," Grix said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen many conflicts come and go. "These pups need to understand what really happened out there." Grix slid the newly prepared drink across the bar towards Zixthera. The liquid inside glowed with a soft blue light, a Kethmori battlefield stimulant that helped with the pain from old injuries. Zixthera looked at the young aliens gathered around her. The Vrex officer had been joined by his friends, and several other young soldiers from different species had moved closer to listen. All of them wore the confident expressions of beings who had never experienced real combat. Her compound eyes grew distant, as if she was seeing something far away and long ago. The clicking of her mandibles slowed to a steady rhythm, like a countdown timer marking the seconds until something terrible was about to begin. "You want to know about humans?" she asked, her voice carrying 50 years of memories and nightmares. "Then listen well, younglings. What I am about to tell you will change how you sleep at night." Zixthara picked up her drink and held it close to her mandibles. The blue liquid inside glowed brighter as it touched the air, casting strange shadows across her scarred face. She took a slow sip, and the young aliens watching could see the glowing substance travel down her throat like liquid starlight. 53 years ago, she began, her voice taking on the tone of someone telling a story that had been repeated many times in her own mind. The Galactic Coalition was at the height of its power. We controlled over 2,000 star systems. Our fleets patrolled the galaxy, keeping peace and order. We thought we had seen everything the universe could offer. She set the drink down carefully, her cybernetic fingers making small clicking sounds against the metal table. Our long-range sensors detected something new. Radio signals coming from a small blue planet in an unremarkable system at the edge of the galaxy. The system had a yellow star, nothing special about it. But the signals were clearly artificial, clearly made by intelligent life. The young Vrex officer who had been laughing earlier now sat completely still. Had continued to darken as stress hormones flooded his system. The other young soldiers pressed closer, forming a tight circle around Zixthera's table. "The species on that world called their system Sol," she continued. "Their planet was the 3rd rock from their star, mostly covered in water. Our science teams studied the radio signals for months. The creatures there were clearly primitive. They had just figured out how to split atoms for energy. They had barely begun launching simple rockets into the space around their planet." An older Hextarian merchant at a nearby table turned his chair to face Zixthera. He remembered the human war, though he had not fought in it. His species had been suppliers of weapons and equipment to coalition forces. High Command held a meeting on the capital world, Zixthera said. "I was not there, of course. I was just a junior officer then, serving on a patrol cruiser. But the orders that came down were clear and simple. Humans would be subjugated. Like any other primitive species we had encountered." She gestured with one of her natural arms, the movement causing her carapace plates to shift and reveal more battle scars underneath. It was supposed to be standard procedure. We had done it hundreds of times before with other young species. Send in a fleet. Demonstrate our superior technology. Demand surrender. Most species saw the wisdom in joining the coalition peacefully. Those that did not were conquered and absorbed anyway. The bartender Grix moved closer, pretending to clean tables but actually listening to every word. He had heard pieces of this story before from other veterans, but never from someone who had been there from the beginning. The coalition decided that humans would make good workers. Zixthera continued. Their planet was rich in resources. They had vast oceans that could be mined for minerals. Their continents were covered with forests that could be harvested. And the humans themselves seemed physically strong enough to do manual labor. She paused and looked directly at the young Vrex officer. High Command thought it would be a simple matter. Add another servant species to the coalition. Take their resources, use their world as a base for further expansion into that region of the galaxy. Standard procedure, as I said. The clicking of her mandibles grew faster, a sign that she was approaching the difficult part of the story. I was assigned to the advance fleet. 300 ships, the pride of the coalition navy. We had dreadnoughts larger than cities, cruisers that could glass entire continents, fighter squadrons that could darken the sky of a planet. Every ship was crewed by experienced soldiers who had fought in dozens of campaigns. She reached for her drink again, but her cybernetic hand trembled slightly. The memory of what came next still affected her after all these years. We expected to find mud hut dwellers when we arrived at their system. Maybe some primitive cities built around rivers or coastlines. Our intelligence reports suggested the humans were still fighting wars with chemical explosives and metal projectiles. They had not even figured out how to leave their own solar system yet. The young aliens leaned even closer. They could sense that something terrible was about to happen in the story, but they could not imagine what it might be. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity, Zixthera said. We would drop out of hyperspace at the edge of their system, send a message demanding surrender, and wait for them to grovel for mercy. If they refused, we would destroy a few of their cities as an example. Then they would surrender, and we would have another conquered world to add to our empire. She took a sip of her drink, the blue glow highlighting the network of scars across her face. But when we dropped out of hyperspace at Proxima Centauri, the nearest star to their home system, we did not find empty space. We found something that should have been impossible. The cantina had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the soft humming of life support systems and the distant noise of machinery deeper in the station. There was a human fleet waiting for us. Not one or two primitive ships, an entire battle fleet. Dozens of warships arranged in perfect military formation, their weapons powered and ready for combat. One of the young soldiers, a Zephyrian with blue skin and large eyes, spoke up in a whisper. But you said they were primitive. How could they have built warships? Zixthera's compound eyes focused on the Zephyrian like targeting computers locking onto a threat. That was exactly what we wondered. Our science officers went crazy trying to understand what they were seeing. In the 30 years since we had first detected human radio signals, somehow these primitive creatures had built a space navy. She gestured toward the ceiling with one of her cybernetic arms. But it got worse. Much worse. Our sensors analyzed their ships and found something that made our commanders panic. The humans had somehow reverse-engineered our own technology. Their ships were built using coalition engineering principles. Their weapons used coalition energy signatures. Their shields operated on coalition frequencies. The old Hexterian merchant made a soft whistling sound, his species equivalent of gasping in surprise. It was impossible, Zixthera continued. We had never made contact with humans before. We had never shared our technology with them. The only way they could have learned our engineering secrets was if they had captured and studied our equipment. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Our commanders realized that our scout probes, sent years earlier to gather information about the human system, must have crashed on human worlds, instead of treating the wreckage as religious artifacts or mysterious gifts from the gods, the way most primitive species would have done. The humans had taken our technology apart piece by piece and figured out how it worked. The young Vrex officer found his voice again. But surely your fleet was still superior. 300 ships against a few dozen human vessels. Zixthera's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter, but there was no humor in the sound. That is what Admiral Vexcar thought. When the human fleet commander opened communications, the admiral expected threats or pleas for mercy. Instead, he heard something that chilled every warrior in our fleet. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Captain Michael Rodriguez of the human ship Enterprise spoke calmly, like he was discussing the weather. He said, "Welcome to human space. You have 10 minutes to withdraw, or we will show you why that is a mistake." 10 minutes, she repeated. Not hours or days to consider surrender. Just 10 minutes to leave or face the consequences. The entire cantina waited for her to continue. Admiral Vexcar laughed at the primitive's audacity and gave the order to attack. 20 minutes later, half our fleet was floating debris, and the rest of us were running for our lives faster than our engines could carry us. Zixthera's cybernetic fingers began tapping against the metal table in a steady rhythm. The sound echoed through the quiet cantina like a countdown timer. It was a nervous habit she had developed during the war, something her body did automatically. When the memories became too vivid and too real, the news from Proxima Centauri reached Coalition High Command within hours, she said, her compound eyes staring into the distance. At first, the generals and admirals refused to believe what they were hearing. A primitive species defeating a Coalition advance fleet. It had to be some kind of mistake or equipment malfunction. She took another drink, the blue liquid casting eerie shadows across her battle-scarred face. Around the cantina, other patrons had begun moving their chairs closer. Even aliens who had been talking loudly at other tables now spoke in whispers, unconsciously drawn into the veteran's tale. High Command decided that the advance fleet had been caught off guard by some kind of trick or trap. They believed that a larger, more powerful force would easily crush the humans and restore Coalition dominance. So they assembled the Grand Fleet. The young Vrex officer who had been mocking humans earlier now sat completely still. His scales had turned almost completely gray, and his hands shook slightly as he held his drink. 5,000 ships, Zixthera continued. The largest military force the Coalition had ever assembled in one place. Dreadnoughts that could destroy continents with single shots, carrier ships loaded with thousands of fighters, supply vessels, carrying enough ammunition and fuel to wage war for decades. She gestured toward the ceiling with one of her natural arms, as if pointing toward the stars themselves. The plan was beautifully simple. It would bypass the outer human colonies entirely, strike directly at their home world, and end the war. Before it could really begin, cut off the head of the snake, as they say, and the body dies. An elderly Morthan trader at a nearby table leaned forward. His species had supplied medical equipment to Coalition forces during the war, and he had heard horror stories from the field hospitals. "I was assigned to the Dreadnought Eternal Victory," Zixthera said. "It was one of the most powerful ships in the Coalition fleet. Its main guns could crack the crust of a planet. Its shields could withstand the explosion of a small star. We felt invincible as we prepared to jump into human space." The tapping of her fingers against the table grew faster, more urgent. Grand Fleet assembled at Kepler Station just outside human territory. 5,000 ships arranged in perfect military formation, ready to deliver the final blow to human resistance. Our intelligence reports said that the human home system contained maybe a dozen defensive platforms and a few patrol ships. She paused and looked directly at each of the young soldiers listening to her story. "When we dropped out of hyperspace, at the edge of the Sol system, we discovered that our intelligence reports were wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. The cantina had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the soft humming of the station's life, support systems, and the distant murmur of conversations in other parts of the facility. The human star system had been transformed into something none of us had ever seen before. It had turned their entire solar system into a fortress." Zixthera's voice took on a tone of amazement mixed with terror, as if she still could not quite believe what she had witnessed. Asteroids throughout the system were moving in perfect formation, not the random, natural orbits that rocks in space usually follow. These asteroids moved in deliberate patterns, like pieces on a game board being arranged by an invisible player. She used her cybernetic arm to gesture in complex patterns, showing how the asteroids had moved.
Ow.
Our science officers thought they were looking at mining operations at first. Humans harvesting resources from space rocks, just like dozens of other species do. But when our scout ships moved closer to investigate, the asteroids opened fire. The young Zephyrian soldier made a small, gasping sound. The asteroids were weapons. Humans had hollowed them out like eggs, Zixthara explained. They removed all the rock and ice from the inside and filled the empty space with fusion. Reactors, shield generators, and weapons systems. Each asteroid had become a mobile weapons platform capable of destroying our largest ships. She took another drink, her hand trembling slightly as she raised the glass to her mandibles. But that was just the beginning. As our fleet moved deeper into the system, we detected massive energy signatures coming from every planet, every moon, every significant piece of rock floating in space. The humans had built military installations everywhere. The old Hexterian. Bartender Grix moved closer, abandoning all pretense of working. He had served drinks to many veterans over the years, but had never heard a first-hand account of the siege of Terra. The real horror was their moon, Zixthara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Luna, they called it. It's a dead rock that orbits their home world. Our sensors detected energy readings that should have been impossible.
Yes.
She shuddered, her carapace plates shifting and revealing more of the scars that covered her body.
Yes.
Advanced scouts investigated. They found that the humans had built entire cities underneath the moon's surface. Not small outposts or research stations. Cities. Millions of humans living in underground complexes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The young soldiers exchanged nervous glances. The idea of an entire civilization hiding beneath the surface of a moon was beyond their understanding. Every human in those cities was armed and ready to fight, Zixthara said. Men, women, even children carried weapons.
How?
They had stockpiled enough supplies to survive for decades, even if their surface was completely destroyed. One of the listeners, a young Kethmori soldier from Zixthara's own species, spoke up. But surely they were just hiding. Civilians taking shelter from the coming battle. Zixthara's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter, but there was no humor in the sound. That is what we thought at first. But when we began our attack on their home world, we learned the truth. The moon was a trap. Everything in their system was a trap. She leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the dim lights of the cantina like tiny mirrors. As soon as our ships moved into attack position, fighters began launching from hidden bases throughout the system. Not just from their planets and moons. From asteroids, from space stations we had not even detected, from what looked like empty space itself. The tapping of her cybernetic fingers against the table had become rapid and urgent, like machine gun fire. And the fighters, she whispered, her voice filled with remembered terror, the fighters were piloted by humans who had surgically modified their own bodies to withstand acceleration forces that would turn any other species into liquid paste. She pointed to a long scar that ran across her thorax. I got this scar when a human fighter pilot named David Thompson rammed his burning ship directly into our command bridge. His fighter was completely destroyed, engines dead, life support failing. He should have ejected and tried to save his own life. Her voice grew even quieter. Instead, he used his ship's remaining momentum to crash into our bridge. I saw his face. Through the cockpit window just before impact, he was smiling. Smiling as he died to take out our command crew. The cantina remained completely silent for several long moments. We lost 60% of the Grand Fleet in the first day of fighting. Zixthara finally continued. 3,000 ships destroyed or crippled beyond repair. Those of us who survived that first day learned the most important lesson about fighting humans. She looked at each of the young soldiers in turn. They do not surrender, they do not retreat, and they never, ever fight fair. The blue glow from Zixthara's drink had begun to fade. But her compound eyes still reflected its dying light as she continued her story. Her voice took on a different tone now, carrying something that the young soldiers had not heard before. It was shame, deep and painful, the kind that comes from being part of something terrible. After the disaster at Seoul, Coalition High Council met an emergency session for 3 straight days, she said, her cybernetic fingers still tapping their nervous rhythm against the table. The military leaders were furious. How could a primitive species destroy 60% of our greatest fleet? It was impossible, unthinkable. She paused and looked around the cantina. Several more aliens had moved closer to listen, forming a growing circle around her table. Even the background music had been turned down so that her words could be heard clearly. The council decided that humans were not fighting like a civilized species should fight. They were using tactics that no honorable military force would consider. Ramming attacks, suicide missions, turning their own civilians into soldiers. The council called it barbaric. The young Vrex officer, his scales now completely gray with stress, leaned forward. What did the coalition do? Zixthera as mandibles clicked slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 50 years of regret. The Coalition High Council declared total war. If humans wanted to fight like animals, we would treat them as animals. All rules of civilized warfare were suspended. All protections for non-combatants were removed. She activated a small holographic display unit built into her cybernetic wrist. The air above her arm shimmered, and suddenly a 3-dimensional star map appeared, floating in the space between her and the listeners. Dozens of star systems were marked with red dots. We began targeting civilian populations, she said quietly. Orbital habitats full of families and children. Research stations operated by scientists who had never held weapons. Mining colonies, where workers were just trying to make a living. The shame in her voice was now impossible to miss. Several of the older aliens in the cantina shifted uncomfortably in their seats, remembering their own species' participation in those attacks. The military commanders believed that humans would surrender once they saw their civilians being killed. Every other species in the galaxy had eventually given up when faced with the destruction of their non-combatant populations. It was a proven strategy. She manipulated the holographic display, and the red markers began blinking one by one. That was our second mistake. The first mistake was attacking them at all. The second mistake was teaching them that we considered civilians to be legitimate targets. The cantina had grown so quiet that the soft humming of the station's life support systems seemed loud in comparison. Even aliens at distant tables had stopped their conversations to listen. Within a month of our civilian strikes, something began happening throughout Coalition space that none of our intelligence services could explain. Coalition worlds began going dark. Zixthara touched one of the red markers on her display, and it expanded to show a detailed view of a star system. Not destroyed, you understand. When our investigation fleets arrived at these systems, they found space stations intact, but completely empty. Orbital platforms undamaged but abandoned. Planetary installations functioning perfectly, but with no sign of life anywhere. She moved to another marker, showing the same pattern. The only sign that humans had been there was a single message, broadcast on all frequencies, repeated over and over until our ships arrived to hear it. The old Hexterian bartender Grix moved even closer, his 6 arms working automatically to clean glasses, while his attention remained focused on the veteran's words. Zixthera's voice became flat and emotionless, as if she was reading from a military report. The message said, "You taught us that civilians are targets. We are fast learners. That was all. No threats, no demands, no explanations." No? Just those 2 sentences, signed by someone called Colonel James Patterson. First human irregular forces. One of the young soldiers, a Zephyrian with pale blue skin, raised a trembling hand. What happened to the people on those worlds? The Coalition civilians? Zixthera. His compound eyes focused on the young alien, and for a moment, something almost like kindness appeared in her expression. They were gone. Civilian personnel, civilian administrators, their families, even their pets. Millions of beings had simply vanished without a trace. Our forensics teams found no signs of violence, no evidence of struggle, no bodies or remains of any kind. She deactivated the holographic display and picked up her drink again. That was when we realized that humans had been holding back during the siege of Terra. They had capabilities we had never imagined. Technologies that could make entire populations disappear without leaving any evidence behind. The tapping of her cybernetic fingers stopped completely as she continued. Ghost fleets began appearing throughout Coalition space. Human ships that moved like shadows struck without warning and vanished before our forces could respond. They were not trying to conquer territory or capture resources. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They were hunting our military leadership. Admirals, generals, intelligence officers, anyone who had been involved in the decision to target civilians. One by one, Coalition commanders began disappearing from their own ships, their own bases, their own heavily guarded headquarters. The young Kethmori soldier from earlier made a small, chittering sound of fear. How could they infiltrate Coalition security? That was exactly what our intelligence services wanted to know, Zixthera replied. But every time they thought they had figured out human capabilities, the humans would do something that should have been impossible. She pointed to a scar on her thorax, a perfectly round mark that looked like it had been made by a high-energy weapon. I got this scar during the siege of Kepler Station, our most secure military installation in the entire galaxy. The station was surrounded by defense platforms, protected by energy shields that could stop planet-killer weapons, monitored by sensor systems that could detect a single molecule of foreign matter. Her mandibles clicked in what might have been amazement. Human strike teams somehow infiltrated the station during a crisis. A reactor malfunction had caused fires throughout the civilian sections, and Coalition personnel were trapped in areas that were too dangerous to reach. The young soldiers exchanged confused glances. They had been expecting a story about human brutality, not human rescue operations. The strike team was not there to steal intelligence or sabotage equipment, Zixthera continued. They were there to rescue Coalition civilians who were trapped by the reactor fire. She gestured toward her prosthetic leg. I was part of a security patrol that encountered them in a smoke-filled corridor. My squad mate had been injured by falling debris and could not walk. We expected the humans to kill us both and continue with whatever mission had brought them to the station. Her voice grew softer, filled with something that might have been wonder. Instead, Lieutenant Rachel Martinez picked up my wounded squad mate and carried him toward the emergency evacuation routes. She could have left him to die in the smoke and flames, should have by any military logic. He was an enemy soldier who had been trying to kill her people. The Xtaris compound eyes seemed to focus on something far away, but she saved him anyway. She nodded to me like we were old friends meeting on a peaceful street, and then vanished back into the smoke to rescue more of our people. The cantina remained completely silent for several long moments. That is what makes humans truly terrifying, she finally said. They are capable of unimaginable brutality against their enemies, but they maintain their moral principles even in the depths of total war. She looked at each of the young soldiers in turn. How do you fight an enemy that shows more compassion than your own allies? Zixthera set down her empty glass and stared at the fading blue residue at the bottom. The glow had almost completely disappeared, leaving only dark liquid that reflected the cantina's dim lights. Her cybernetic fingers had stopped their nervous tapping, and for the first time since she had begun telling her story, she seemed completely still. The war officially lasted for years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through every day of those years. But in truth, it was over much sooner than that. The Coalition just did not know it yet. She looked around the circle of young faces watching her. The Vrex officer's scales had turned completely gray, a permanent change that would mark him as someone who had experienced true fear. The other soldiers sat frozen in their chairs, afraid to move or speak. Our intelligence services had been trying to crack human communication networks from the very beginning of the conflict. It was standard procedure during any war. Learn how your enemy talks to each other, and you can predict what they will do next. The old Hexterian bartender Grix moved closer, abandoning any pretense of working. In all his years of running the cantina, He had never heard such a complete account of the human war from someone who had been there from beginning to end. For 3.5 years, human communications remained completely secure. Our best codebreakers, our most advanced computer systems, our captured human equipment, nothing could penetrate their encryption methods. They seemed to be using some kind of quantum entanglement technology that was far beyond our understanding. Sixthera's compound eyes grew distant as she remembered. Then, 6 months before the war ended, one of our intelligence teams got lucky. They captured a damaged human ship with its communication system still partially intact. It took them weeks of careful work, but they finally managed to access some of the data stored in the ship's computers. She activated her holographic display one final time. The star map that appeared showed human and coalition territories, but now there were additional markers and symbols that had not been there before. What our intelligence services discovered in those files broke the High Council's will to fight. Every engagement we had fought, every battle we had won or lost, every crushing defeat we had suffered, the humans had detailed records of all of it. The young Zephyrian soldier leaned forward. They were keeping track of the battles. That seems normal for any military force. Zixthera's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. They were not just keeping track. They were analyzing every coalition tactic, every weapon system, every strategic decision. But more importantly, they were documenting their own capabilities, the capabilities they had chosen not to use. She manipulated the holographic display, and new information began appearing. Technical specifications, weapon designs, fleet compositions that made the young officers gasp in shock. Antimatter warheads capable of destroying entire star systems. Stellar manipulation technology that could cause suns to go supernova on command. Planet-cracking weapons that could split worlds in half with a single shot. The display showed more horrors. Ships that could move faster than light without using hyperspace. Weapons that could reach across interstellar distances. Defense systems that could protect entire sectors of space. The humans had developed fleets that could devour solar systems, weapons that could exterminate all life in a galaxy. They had the technology to end the war in days, to wipe out every coalition species with the push of a button. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of Zixthera's breathing was clearly audible. Even aliens at distant tables had stopped talking completely, sensing that something momentous was being revealed. But they did not use any of it, whispered the young Vrex officer, his voice barely audible. Her own voice soft with something that might have been wonder. They did not. Despite everything we did to them, despite the horrors we inflicted on their colonies, despite our attempts to commit genocide against their entire species, they chose to be better than us. She deactivated the holographic display and slowly stood up from her chair. Her prosthetic legs hissed softly as hydraulic systems adjusted to support her weight. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The Coalition High Council called for immediate peace negotiations the moment they learned what humans were capable of. The war ended not because we were losing, though we were, but because our leaders finally understood that we were fighting an enemy. It could have destroyed us at any time, but had chosen not to. Zixthera began moving toward the cantina's exit, but she walked slowly, as if her artificial limbs were carrying more weight than just her body. The peace treaty was signed aboard the human flagship Indomitable. I was there as part of the coalition delegation, representing the survivors of the Grand Fleet. Admiral William Hayes was the chief human negotiator. She paused near a table, where several older aliens sat, all of whom had stopped their conversations to listen. Hayes could have dictated any terms he wanted. He could have demanded massive reparations that would have bankrupted our worlds for generations. He could have carved up coalition space and claimed the best systems for human expansion. He could have executed every coalition military officer who had participated in civilian attacks. Her voice grew softer, filled with something approaching reverence. Instead, he asked for only one thing: a guarantee that no species would ever again suffer what humanity had endured during the war. He wanted the coalition to promise that we would never again target civilian populations, never again attempt genocide, never again start wars of conquest. The young soldiers exchanged glances, trying to understand what they were hearing. The coalition agreed immediately. Zixthera continued. We signed every treaty, accepted every condition, agreed to every restriction Admiral Hayes proposed. And in return, the Terran Defense Force became the galaxy's peacekeepers. She reached the cantina's doorway and turned back to face her audience one final time. Not through conquest, you understand. Not through occupation or colonization. Humans earned their position as galactic peacekeepers through the reputation they had built during those 4 bloody years of war. Her compound eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every expression of shock and understanding. Today, human patrol fleets keep the trade lanes safe from pirates and raiders. Human colonies serve as neutral meeting grounds for diplomatic negotiations between species that might otherwise go to war. Human medical ships respond to disasters across the galaxy, saving lives regardless of which species needs help. She gestured toward the ceiling with one of her cybernetic arms. But never forget what they are capable of. Never forget that humanity earned their place in galactic society not through politics or economics or smooth diplomacy, but through their willingness to face complete extinction rather than surrender their moral principles. Zixthera stepped into the doorway, her silhouette framed by the lights from the station corridor beyond. Sleep well tonight, younglings. Sleep peacefully knowing that somewhere out there, humans like Captain Rodriguez, Lieutenant Martinez, and Admiral Hayes stand watch between civilization and chaos. Her voice carried clearly through the silent cantina as she delivered her final warning. Pray to whatever gods your species worship that you never give them reason to show you why the entire galaxy learned to fear the species from Sol. The cantina remained completely silent long after the sound of her footsteps had faded into the distance.
Oh.
Each alien sat lost in thought, contemplating the sleeping giants, who now guarded their peace and the terrible price that had been paid to learn the true nature of humanity.